everyone is talking about this act being about protecting children from predators. And obviously, Mr. Kyle has accused our leader, Nigel, of being essentially on the side of predators because of the position we've taken on the act. Most of these kids, and the evidence is there in the App Store charts, are just going and downloading these VPNs. And then what happens? As I said, the propensity for them to end up in the depths of the internet, and I keep saying this, if you're a parent, do not get lulled into a false sense of security as a result of this act. Your children's activity is now invisible to you entirely. Labour appear to have no answer to that. They won a huge majority, albeit it was somewhat of a thin and loveless landslide. It was a huge majority. What has happened since then is that it has become abundantly clear that the Prime Minister clearly doesn't believe in anything. He has no North Star from a political standpoint.
Zia Yusuf, thank you for coming to PoliticsJOE studio.
My pleasure to be here.
We are going to talk about the Online Safety Act, which you have objections to. We also have objections to it. Do you want to run through what are the main, what are the sort of criteria that doesn't sit well with you?
Well, any student of history knows that the way tyranny starts to take hold is usually quite gradual. And what happens is safety and security tyranny is wrapped up in the warm fuzz of safety and security, and people and legislators hope people don't read the small print. We have read the small print. It's about 200 pages. It's a gargantuan act. And remember, it was the Tory party who birthed this and then passed it with pretty much no objections at all, other than maybe some of them said it didn't go far enough. And if you look at some specific parts of the act, the auspice is that it's supposed to keep children safe. Our view is it actually makes children less safe. We can come on to why, particularly because it is driving, anyone who understands technology, anyone who actually speaks to young people using the internet would have told you're going to see an exponential rise in downloads of VPNs. That is going to take kids down into the deepest, darkest depths of the internet, specifically, the dark web. But more to the point, there's sections in there, for example, Section 44, that gives the Secretary of State, Mr. Kyle himself, in reality right now, the ability to unilaterally order Ofcom to rewrite the rules with regards to not just what is illegal speech, but what social media companies are legally obliged to proactively censor and take down with extraordinary penalties. This is also really important because they've, I think, quite deliberately created a perverse incentive structure for these social media platforms. So 10% of global revenues. As much as I love the UK, these are global platforms where the UK is an infinitesimal proportion of their revenues, and potentially jail time for their management teams. So what are they going to do? They're going to be overly censorious. Then there's Section 179 that creates a threshold, far be it from causing direct harm to children or actively or inciting violence, which are quite familiar legal thresholds. It creates a threshold of causing non-trivial psychological harm. That's a direct quote from the Act. Who determines that? And now you've got already evidence of quite serious things actually being removed, being censored, even on X, which I would say is probably, you would assume, would be the strongest in terms of free speech due to its ownership. You've seen Katie Lamb's speech about the grooming gangs in the House of Commons, where there's supposed to be parliamentary privilege. That's been censored. A transcript from one of the trials in the grooming gang cases, that has been censored. And then you have some more humorous ones, although no less, I think, instructive. I just tweeted out on the way here, Guido reporting today that their story reporting that there were 0 babies named Keir last year in the UK. That is being actively censored on X. So what we're seeing is this quite Orwellian situation where speech, anti-government sentiment, particularly, for example, people raising concerns about immigration, that is being actively censored. And, as Layla Cunningham said in the last few days, if this was just about protecting children, why is there, and I quote, an elite police force that has been created to monitor anti-migrant sentiment online? So this is really, I think, quite dystopian stuff.
I definitely want to park the pornography stuff for one moment, because I think there's been a hyper focus on the pornography, because it's much bigger than that. It's what you're talking about there. You're talking about this anti-immigration sentiment that is being blocked currently on X. There will be cheerleaders out there who may be pro-migration, who would say, actually, I don't want to see that on my social media platform, so this benefits me. But it does have a draconian feel to it. I mean, there is also protest. that is something that is going to be eliminated from social media sites. So is your argument that the government shouldn't be the arbiter of what can and cannot appear online?
Correct. Well, so hold on. So there's a couple of different points there, right? And again, there's lots of conflation happening quite deliberately because again, this was the auspice of this whole thing was we've got to protect children from depraved content on the internet. We would agree that that is a noble thing to do, and we've got to get legislation that does that. The reason why Reform and Nigel have said a Reform government would repeal the entire act is because it's so unfit for purpose. It is so beyond doing that. And like I said, the fact that you've seen 4 of the top 5 apps in the Apple App Store as we speak in terms of downloads in the download charts are VPNs.
Which will resonate with our audience because I mean our audience are that they're
course.
online, and they'll know that with a VPN the dangers of that are that that they operate by, if you want to use someone's IP in Belgium, then they swap.
Yeah.
So that means that someone who might be accessing actually extraordinarily harmful content could be using your IP, and that is dangerous.
It is.
There's a sense that perhaps the Labour ministers who are out promoting this don't quite understand.
I don't think they remotely understand. I think they like the fact that, for example, talked about protests. There was I can give you a specific example of a protest in Leeds about a migrant hotel locally that's being throttled online. But this isn't just about whether it's a protest against migration or whatever it might be. This is, again, any legislation that causes footage of perfectly legal and lawful protests to be removed from social media, I think is dystopian and sends us down a very, very dark place. Of course, the Labour ministers don't understand it. The Tory MPs and ministers didn't understand. I mean, I made the point that one of the root causes of a lot of this is, for example, Mr. Kyle, who came out and said, basically, if you are against this Online Safety Act, you're on the side of paedophiles and Jimmy Savile, and specifically laid that allegation against Nigel.
Extraordinary allegation.
I think it's the most disgusting thing any politician. I'm 38. I cannot remember, and this is a low bar we're talking about here, a more disgusting thing a politician has said in the political arena. And again, it's a very chilling thing to do because it says either. So what it does is say you cannot have a legitimate discussion and raise legitimate concerns about a bill and an act. I want to go back again though to the idea of protecting children from harm online, which again was the original premise and auspice of the bill. I tried to get this point across on Newsnight last night or a couple of nights ago, and I got shouted down. One of the really pernicious things that's happening now is because of the preponderance of VPNs amongst these young people. If you're a parent and you've turned on your child safety locks and parental controls, and you think you have an ability to monitor what your children are looking at on the internet through your internet service provider, Sky Broadband, BT, they all provide this. EE, the VPNs defeat all of that because they hide the metadata. So again, it's not only that it's failing to improve safety online, it is, I think, going to prove extraordinarily damaging to safety for children online. And all it's doing is, and I say this as someone who is in Reform and would be probably on a different side of the political spectrum to some other people who are also against this act. But I will defend everybody's right to go and protest peacefully, even if it's to go and protest for a cause I don't support. And again, this goes back to what is a democracy about? If you don't have freedom of speech, if the government is able to, and I go back again, Section 44, I think would make Xi Jinping blush. The total lack of check and balance, the ability for a Secretary of State to unilaterally order Ofcom to rewrite the rules about what social media companies can and cannot publish on their platforms. Jim Jordan from America has been publishing on X over the last 24 hours correspondence that has now come to light where social media platforms have been written to by DSET, Peter Kyle's department, specifically referencing concerns about, quote, narratives about two-tier policing and demanding to know what those platforms are doing about that, which again is a deeply censorious, deeply troubling and chilling. I think it's pretty terrifying, frankly, and this is why we're being as vocal as we can, because if we're not vocal about this and this just becomes the norm, we're going to be in a situation where whoever is the government of the day has pretty terrifying abilities to curtail free speech. There is historical precedence for this. It was in Russia in 2012. There was a not dissimilar act in the Duma where they basically said it was all about protecting children, and the result of that legislation was that it censored any content with regards to LGBT, for example, content that people in this country would consider perfectly fine and sensible. And it also, of course, created a pretext for anti-Putin and anti-government commentary to be totally censored from the internet. The parallels, I think, are very, very concerning.
But on the other side of it, you've got a situation. So I imagine what Labour ministers would argue. If you look at the Southport riots of last year, and we've had multiple representatives from these social media companies have appeared in select committee, and they've been asked questions about what profit did they make out of the furore that was whipped up online about the sharing of content during that time. Do you see the dangers in algorithms, and is that separate to your criticism of the Online Safety Act?
Yeah, it totally is separate to the criticism of the Online Safety Act. Like, I built a tech company. I have a reasonably good understanding of tech and AI. And by the way, almost all of this moderation is not being done by groups of people. It is being outsourced. It's essentially being delegated to AI writ large, which is exactly what you would expect.
Which do you think is more? I mean, which is worse, really? Because if you've got, I mean, for example, like on Reddit, yesterday I had to use the webcam to verify my age, and I passed with flying colours, which I found very rude. But is it better that an AI is determining my age, or is it better that it gets sent off to another country where someone is verifying that they think you're over a certain age?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't take too, even if it's an AI that is verifying your age, and this is this whole other big problem here. That image is being stored. If parents are watching this, photos of your children are being stored on servers from, in many cases, we're doing more research on this, and we'll publish some of this stuff, like companies that look pretty darn sketch, not companies that I would want harboring images of my, I don't have children, but if I had kids, I wouldn't want those companies having it. And also, it's a huge threat in terms of data leaks as well, by the way. So, going back to the point, though, about social media algorithms, there does, of course, need to be some standard. And we can, I sympathize totally with the idea that we need to have a duty of care for social media platforms to keep children safe, to prevent obvious kind of malicious misinformation from causing social harm. That is one thing, but that's not what we're seeing here. And if you look at what actually happened, for example, you go back to Southport, a lot of this is a distraction mechanism. The fundamental issue here was that, with Southport specifically, was that the police failed to share information that it had. They left a huge information vacuum that then created the space for people with big followings on social media to say things that were untrue about the attacks and the attacker. And you don't need to take my word for that. You can take the word of Mr. Hall KC, the government's own independent anti-terrorism law czar. He said exactly that. And remember, I was in the room when Nigel recorded a video when he said, is something being kept from us, with regards to, was he on a watch list? We now know the attacker, the monster at Southport, had been reported to prevent a number of times. So look, moderation on social media is a difficult problem. I'm not trying to be reductive about it, but we are totally missing the point if we think that this, again, Orwellianly named Online Safety Act, which is 200 pages long and goes so far and is so extreme that, as I said, look at the evidence we're already seeing within 72 hours. And a tongue-in-cheek article about the fact that there are 0 babies being named Keir in the UK last year is being censored. I mean, again, that is something straight out of the Putin and Xi Jinping playbook.
I think, the other side to this, of course, is that you are creating a de facto police state, because we're also hearing about police who are now being instructed to monitor certain pockets of social media. Does that concern you?
Of course. And again, I say this, that elite force, I think it's called the Internet Intelligence Investigations Unit, right? Pretty darn terrifying thing. And again, what they're not doing, it's not a police force that is looking in the deepest, darkest parts of the internet forums for people using Tor to go and buy weapons and create chemical weapons. It's about monitoring, and I quote, anti-migrant sentiment. And I will say this with all seriousness.
Do you worry also about the other side of that argument? Do you worry about, say, groups like Stand Up to Racism, or perhaps now prescribed terrorist organizations that, collectives akin to those who aren't terrorists, who might be organizing online and are now being censored? Do you speak for them as well?
I mean, some of those organizations have said things incredibly disparaging and false things about me and Nigel. But the reality is, we live in a country, we live in a democracy. Obviously, there are some limits to freedom of speech in this country. Shouting fire in a theater and incitement to violence, etc. But the short answer is absolutely yes. This is the whole point. If through this legislation, I go back to the original point, Section 44. A Secretary of State, a single human being, can unilaterally order Ofcom to change the rules about what you or I can say on the internet. That is a terrifying thing. And this is why, some people said, when I said, this is turning Britain into a China-style surveillance state, people accused me of hyperbole. And what I would say is, go and read the Act. Then go and look at the incentives it creates for social media companies. If you're Mark Zuckerberg or you're Elon Musk, whatever it is, you've probably got a management team who will walk through walls for you and are very loyal. Asking them to go to jail because they might come down on one side of a grey area versus another, I think is a very, very tall order. And again, I go back to, we're not speculating here. We have got a preponderance of evidence. You talk about protecting predators. It's specifically you talk about protecting people from protecting children from predators. Apologies.
Just had to make that clear.
Yeah. Apologies. Everyone is talking about this act being about protecting children from predators, and obviously Mr. Kyle has accused our leader Nigel of being essentially on the side of predators because of the position we've taken on the Act. If you actually look at what is being censored, it is Katie Lamb's speech about the grooming gangs in the House of Commons. It is legal transcripts about the grooming gangs, which are incredibly instructive and shine a bright, disinfecting light, I think, on the cover-ups that happened, which there are obviously thousands and thousands of young women who have been victims of all of this. So again, it is doing the opposite of what the Act was supposed to do.
And you've also got Reddit forums like, the r/sexual assault forum, which is a space predominantly for people to talk about assault that they've experienced, and that is now censored.
That one. There's other Reddit forums helping people get over PTSD. Actually quite productive parts of Reddit. There's another one which was really, again, focused on helping people deal with if you're a victim of bullying, helping people deal with that. These are all being censored. And I go back to the point, most of these kids, and the evidence is there in the App Store charts, are just going and downloading these VPNs. And then what happens? As I said, the propensity for them to end up in the depths of the internet, and I keep saying this, if you're a parent, do not get lulled into a false sense of security as a result of this act. Your children's activity is now invisible to you entirely if they're using these VPNs. All of your monitoring systems, your boundary conditions that you set through your ISP are now totally defeated. Labour appear to have no answer to that. One other thing as well, which is really important in the Act, is they have laid the foundations for the breaking of end-to-end encryption, which again will put us in a
really?
Yeah. So what they have said is they will not yet enforce in this regard. So what they're saying is even platforms like WhatsApp or Signal, these are two platforms that have sounded the alarm with regards to this. And it was because they sounded the alarm, actually, if you actually look at the history of this, some of this, that's where the government then said, we're not going to enforce on this yet. They're saying that if you have... these platforms do have a duty of care to look at what's going on these end-to-end encryption platforms. And they've said once the technology exists to allow for them to do that without breaking end-to-end encryption, then it will fall in scope. But the foundations from a legislative standpoint are already there. And if, again, we all know which direction all of this stuff goes. I think it's a matter of time before that happens. If you're in any doubt about that, iPhone users, the most powerful service Apple offers in terms of encrypting your iCloud data, your iMessages, your photos and videos, etc., that isn't available in the UK. In the same way, it's not available in China. Why? Because the British government, through all of this sort of legislation, has created a scenario where basically would have made it impossible for Apple to comply. So Apple said, we're withdrawing that service. And so what that means is, again, somebody from the Home Office, without you even knowing, could, as we speak, be looking through your messages and your photos and your videos that you think are secure to you.
And I think that there's sort of I could laugh there and I could say, well, they're not going to find anything interesting. But the point is that that's done without your consent, and that is not That is not what is promised to you when you first downloaded these
And without
applications.
your knowledge, importantly. So if somebody,
Absolutely.
if the police physically turn up at your door and raid, and take away your hard drives, that's one thing. And again, we've got to consider
No, it
this is
requires a warrant. You know,
sorry.
so it requires
It
warrants.
requires a
So
warrant, but
different
because
to
they're in the
yeah.
background, you don't know about any of it.
That's what I'm
That's my
saying.
point.
I'm
Yeah.
agreeing with you.
Yeah.
You know, I want to talk actually a little bit about the age verification
Yeah.
software that is being utilized. So there's one company called Persona that's on LinkedIn, that's on Reddit. This is the webcam, the very rude webcam that I used a couple of days ago. Are you concerned about private companies having access to this data? I mean, would you prefer a nationalized system? Because I mean, just after the last 2 weeks where we found that, you know, we learned of this obscene data breach of many Afghan, well now quote unquote refugees,
Yep.
or asylum seekers, that being leaked.
Yeah.
Who would you trust to do this age verification?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't just the names of the Afghans. It was also the names of our special operators. And it was an extraordinary. I mean, how all of these names were just sitting in an Excel file and were able to be emailed in and of itself is a scandal. So, look, I think obviously gravely concerned about that. There are many examples of data leaks causing huge ruination of lives, and I think that's a grave concern. I don't think making it a national database and handing all of that data to the government is a good idea either. We're intrinsically pretty skeptical, especially in this digital age where, one of the things about AI is that it collapses the cost of surveilling your population. It just does, right? So historically, it was quite costly to listen to what everybody was saying and to understand it and to synthesize it and to clamp down on it. Now, the cost of AI can do that extremely quickly. If you're in any doubt about that, look at those note-taking apps that you can use on Zoom or Google Meets or Teams. Now imagine intelligence agencies using those writ large, which they are in many countries. So we're very skeptical about that. And I think that I don't see any valid reason why people should be needing to scan their faces and hand over their photos into any national database.
Because the other side of that argument would be is that you've already got companies like Apple who own an extraordinary amount of data on you anyway. So does it matter? Has the sort of is the dam broken already?
So people are volunteering that data into Apple, into our iCloud systems. And again, it looms large that in the UK, you might not be aware of this, but that advanced privacy protection that Apple offers almost everywhere in the world, other than inside the most, Orwellian and nefarious dictatorships, it's not available here. I think that look, there are lots of different technical ways you could try to achieve this problem, right? So there's a type of token which is a zero knowledge token, which would allow, for example, if you want, one way you could implement it is you could have tokens that sit on devices that store no personal information about the user whatsoever. So the website doesn't have any information about your name, doesn't have your photo or your address or anything like that. But all it does is certify that you are above a certain age.
But who would deliver those? Who would check those before they're handed to you?
So that could be done again through a vehicle that keeps that has the image. For example, it could be done through a photograph, and that could potentially be done in a way technically that is instantaneous in the analysis of the photo and the deletion of the photo from the database. That's a really fundamental point. At the moment, and there's quite a lot about this on social media already.
Storage that's the issue here.
It's a storage that's the issue. I wouldn't want a private company, and again, in some cases, quite sketch private companies, from what we can tell, and we're going to publish this stuff in the coming days, who have photos of either you or your children, which is quite worrying. But I also think I don't think it's a good idea to give the government information in that direct way about exactly what you're looking at online. And I want to emphasize again, what's happening right now in many cases is the opposite. It's so easy to opt out of this right now by just downloading a VPN, which is obviously what a lot of people are doing.
Which they're now going to ban.
Well, if we did that, we would be an extraordinarily elite company. You're talking China, Myanmar, Pakistan, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia.
What a party. I think we should probably actually talk about the Newsnight interview that you I think it's fair to say you endured a couple of days ago.
First of all, as someone who built a tech company and understands tech, frankly, unlike the dinosaurs who actually wrote this bill, what we need to do is ensure that children are actually protected. What we actually haven't talked about here is this act makes children less safe. The evidence of that is 4 of the top 5 most downloaded apps in the Apple App Store as we speak are VPNs. These are virtual networks that allow children to spoof their location anywhere in the world. The 13 to 16-year-olds, anyone who's encountered a 13 to 16-year-old these days will tell you they will run rings around most baby boomers who draft this legislation. And what that then means, they're much more likely to go to places like the dark web. And I want to say this too. If you're a parent, it's really important you know this. Don't be lulled into a false sense of security. If you set parental controls and monitoring with your ISP, with Sky Internet, EE Internet, BT Internet, those VPNs defeat.
Those VPNs defeat. Okay, let's not all talk at the same time because that's no good for anyone.
That's Thangam Debbonaire, who lost a safe Labour seat at the last election. Did you think that she was? Did you think that she was open to your ideas that evening?
I think I can safely say, based on her body language and her gesticulations, that she wasn't. To be honest, it was just sort of strange. I'll be completely honest. I just sat there, and to have a human beside you doing all of those things while you're saying what, in my view, were pretty reasonable things, even if you disagreed with the substance of what I was saying, I just found it very strange. And I think if you look at the what people have been saying on social media, in some cases, people from the left as well, not necessarily people who would support reform. I think that when you're there as a representative of essentially to represent the position of a government whose popularity has collapsed at historic speed, I think that you should probably be doing everything you can to come across well, be perceived as genuinely interested and listening to counter arguments and why people are concerned about what your government is doing. Obviously, she did the opposite.
I found it odd because I think in principle what you were saying at that time, when she was displaying that rather extraordinary body language, it seemed rather sensible. You weren't talking about something that was, totally abstract from, these are the sort of concerns that I would say most British people have at this time. And I wonder, what do you think that says about Labour in general at the moment, about how they're faring? Do you think that they are receptive to the concerns that people are raising?
No, I think they are, in many cases, deluded. And look, I say that as someone who, look, if you just look at what has happened since they won a massive majority, we shouldn't forget that they won a huge majority, albeit it was somewhat of a thin and loveless landslide. It was a huge majority, and what has happened since then is that it has become abundantly clear that the Prime Minister clearly doesn't believe in anything. He has no North Star from a political standpoint. And anytime people have raised concerns, however valid, it has been met with, and I think that's what you saw on Newsnight, which is condescension, sneering. I mean, at one point, she was literally pretending to be asleep, and that was sort of disconcerting. Maybe that was the goal of it. It was to sort of put me off. But if you're visibly pretending to be asleep while somebody is articulating concerns about a piece of legislation, and as you said, not in some ad hominem crazy way, but in a reasonably precise way, again, regardless of where you stand on the issue, it comes across, I think, exactly the way it was intended, which was, this is so beneath me. That's what the body language communicated. Enduring this person talk and make points is beneath me. And I think that's, well, I think most people, if you were to do any form of media training, would probably say that's probably not the perception you want to radiate.
It's interesting because there are a number of canvassers who were working with her during the last election who I had known at the time that she'd been rather rude to constituents, or dismissive to constituents about their current critique, their critique at the time of the Labour position on Palestine, and that she hadn't been particularly receptive to some of the voters' concerns. And I did receive a number of texts that evening that said this is why she lost the seat.
And she lost her seat, by the way, in the context of a massive Labour landslide.
At a safe seat, I would stress. But Bristol has always been Labour. Well, apart from the Greens. I want to just briefly talk, because I know you have to go, about Adam Holloway, who has defected to the Reform Party. What is it that you saw in Adam that you decided to take him on?
Well, look, what Adam has done, he's chosen to join our party. He hasn't taken on a senior position or a specific role per se, but he is somebody who he's a veteran. He served our country. I think he's written very eloquently in The Spectator today. And I'd encourage people to go and read that. What he has said is
I'm not sure if you're going to find that audience on here, but
well, that doesn't detract from the
I do
eloquence
think
with
you get
which he
one
wrote.
free article a month, so maybe they can go and read
there
that.
you go.
Yeah.
So you don't need to worry about the paywall. But he articulates far better than I can do justice why he joined. I mean, when he says that there are meaningful differences between when Kemi says there are meaningful differences between where the Tories are now and where Reform are, he says I agree. I just agree with the Reform position. And so look, we're a party that we've got close to, we've got north of, I think, 230,000 members as we speak. We have many people joining us from the former Tory voters, former Labour voters, some former Lib Dems, and we have people who have really been disengaged with politics their entire adult lives, and long may that continue.
What about Ben Houchen? When will he be making the move?
Look, I'm not going to comment on any specific names. Look, I think I will say this, though. Sometimes people have knocked on our door and said, hey, I'm interested in joining, and try to lay down these conditions or made certain demands. I'm not going to name names here. And there's not going to be any appetite to do that because, we're still some way off, a general election. I want to go back to the original point. So often the narrative is, when's the next Tory defection coming? And of course, there are some really good, honourable people inside the Conservative Party, including some current MPs and some former MPs. But as I said, if you actually look at the data from what's taken us from 14 to anywhere between 30 and 32% in the average of the polls at the moment, the majority of that move has not been people who voted Tory in the last general election. A lot of it has been people who didn't vote at all. That's the biggest category in the last
Any
general
former
election.
socialists?
Well, look, I will say this, that people are now of the view. I mean, I remember we did a Scottish conference some months ago, and the taxi driver said, I voted SNP my entire life, and I'm going to vote for you guys next time because I'm so sick of this sort of establishment politicians who tell us all of these things and then betray us. And even if I don't agree with everything Nigel says, I genuinely believe he means what he says, and he will move mountains to do the things that he says he's going to do. And I think that's such a competitive advantage in modern politics.
Is there a worry that if you take on too many Tory MPs or former Tory MPs, that you have perhaps you'll be perceived as a party of old rather than the vision that I presume you are attempting to project, which is that you are something fresh and you are a new conception altogether?
100%. Of course there is. And look, I've been pretty vocal about, for example, I think if you were a Tory MP, if you were sitting in the cabinet and you knew about this Afghan cover-up, and you were cloaked by you essentially had the immunity of parliamentary privilege, and you did nothing about it, I'm sorry, but you need to be held accountable for that. I think that renders your ability to then run around talking about the crimes that these people are committing in this country null and void, as far as I'm concerned. And then on top of that, some of these people then, again, some people, they say, oh, we've got to learn from our mistakes. We've got to be open about it. Well, then why have you then claimed that you couldn't have said anything? I'm talking, for example, Robert Jenrick here, who said, oh, I wanted to say something, but I couldn't because I was encumbered by the Official Secrets Act. Your parliamentary privilege trumped that. And if anyone's in any doubt about that, you can go and look at legal experts who have made this point. There were literally select committees where you can look at the transcript and they say in their report, they go through the Official Secrets Act, they say that's exactly what parliamentary privilege is there for, specifically situations like this. So, no, look.
But Rory Stewart as well, he still is pushing that line, actually, that he couldn't say things because of...
And again, I think, so I take issue with that specifically because I think this cover-up, which we're still learning ever more details of, I do think it renders and it shines a bright light then on people running around posting on X about crimes committed by Afghan nationals in the UK.
I just want to ask you finally, just a bit more specifics. I accept that you will not be taking all of them, but what sort of region are we in? Of how many Conservatives are have expressed an interest to you in joining reform?
Well, if you say expressed an interest, if you define that term as having some interest, a lot, right? But that's a very different thing from saying, if we're talking about sitting MPs, wanting to come over. Look, one thing I will say about a lot of Conservatives, perhaps the clue's in the name, they're pretty risk averse, and as we've continued to gain in the polls, I think what's going to end up happening, one thing our defections team look at very closely is sort of what are your motivations for wanting to defect. So if you're a councillor and the polls show that you're going to get obliterated in your seat in 3 months' time, and you're trying to come over, the threshold for you coming over is probably that much higher. I think there's a very good chance. I mean, if you look at the analysis, particularly once you bake in a Corbyn party into the polls, most of the analysis of those polls put us between 350 and 425 seats and put the Tories down on like 20. I think
425 seats.
Some of them do, yeah. Some of them put us on 425. Now we're not taking that to the bank, and there's obviously a long way to go. But the point I'm making is that there's going to be an annihilation. I think 0 seats for the Tories genuinely is on the cards. I really do think that. Which, going back to your point, and I want to stress, there are some Tories who are good people and whose hearts are in the right place, and I think will join us, including current MPs. But they won't be that many. And as you quite rightly said, one of the reasons reform has had the success that it has is because people are looking for a marked break from that disastrous 14 years that, the Tories inflicted. Even the Online Safety Act. I know we're talking about Kyle and all this stuff, and I'm sure a lot of Labour MPs and cabinet ministers love it, but it was the Tories that inflicted all of this on us. And to the degree there was objection, it was people like Suella Braverman and Philp saying that the bill didn't go far enough.
On that ominous note, will you come back?
Absolutely.
Lovely to have you.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.